Well, howdy YouTube family. It is Bold CRNA coming to you with another week's topic. This week we're going to be talking about, did I hate being a nurse? And a lot of you guys are asking this kind of question, I think because of the trial that happened last week that showed us that you're not so safe being a nurse. You could get criminally charged. So there's people out there saying, maybe I want to leave the career field altogether. So today we're going to talk about it a little bit more in depth. Let's get into spilling the tea today. Let's go over here and get a little more comfortable. The things that I liked about being a nurse. I like the schedule. That's something that a lot of people they take for granted essentially when you're an RN and you're working 312s. And you know, the 312s are rough, granted, but after you're done with your 3 12-hour shifts, you're done for the week. And honestly, a lot of doctors envy that, especially residents. They look at that 312s and they say, man, if only I could have a schedule where I could just work 3 days a week and that is full-time work. And when I'm done, I've got 4 days off a week. Now there is a lot more to that than what it sounds like on the surface, and you nurses out there know that. So the schedule of a nurse, like I mentioned, 312s, a lot of people work a 4th 12. So if you're looking for overtime, you want to make a little bit extra money, you kind of have to work a 4th 12. There are some places that'll say, hey, you can just come in and do like a 4 or 6 hour shift and go home early or something like that. Maybe someone will split the shift with you. But in general, I found in my 4 years working as a nurse that if I wanted a little extra money or overtime for that week, I was pretty much committing myself to a whole nother 12-hour shift, which is 48 hours. That's not horrible, especially as a CRNA and especially as I've seen surgeons and other providers and stuff in their schedules. 48 hours is pretty light compared to what a lot of other people in medicine work. But as a nurse, as an RN, you may not want to work 48 hours. That's a lot. And statistically, that's well over a full-time schedule. So especially if you're doing that consistently, which a lot of nurses seem to do that, they'll pick up like a 4 12-hour shift for overtime pay, and they'll do it every week or every other week. And they're frequently working, well beyond full time. The other thing about the schedule for an RN is it's almost always 7A to 7P or 7P to 7A. And if you don't want to work 7A to 7P or 7P to 7A, you're gonna have a hard time finding a job. Most jobs as an RN are gonna be at a hospital system, and hospital systems across the nation are going to typically work on that 7A to 7P, 7P to 7A schedule, and there's not really much in between in there. Occasionally you'll find a hospital that'll do 8-hour shifts, but I find that extremely rare. Maybe like one hospital I've come across here in the Bay Area allows nurses to do 8-hour shifts, and maybe you might find a couple union hospitals where they've like lobbied and petitioned for that to be a possibility, but it's rare, especially nowadays. I think back 15, 20 years ago it was more common, but now almost everywhere it's a 12-hour shift. And if it's not day shift, it's night shift. Oh, and I forget to mention that night shift is the shift that is always understaffed. There are some people who like night shift, but in general, a lot of people don't like night shift. So you find as a new grad nurse or a new nurse hire in a facility, you often get shoved off to night shift, even if you don't want to work night shift. If you don't like it, you're still kind of pushed off onto that kind of shift because it's the hardest shift for them to find coverage. So if you don't like working night shift, being a nurse could be hard for you because it can be kind of difficult to find a job, especially for a new hire or a new grad that's day shift. Another aspect about the schedule as a nurse is you're almost always a W-2 employee, which means they're going to dictate your schedule for you. You don't really have the power or control as an RN to say, I want to work these days, or I don't want to work these days, or I want to take vacations on these times. Everything has to go through approval processes, managers. You are an employee, so they control your schedule, which means they control your life essentially. And they will be able to dictate to you when you do things and when you go places and when you can't go places. And that can be tough. That can be a tough thing to deal with, especially from my perspective as I've gone on in my career. And of course I'm a CRNA now, and I do 1099 contracts, and I have my own S Corp, and I am my own employer, and I own my own business, me being the business, and I decide all those aspects of my life now. And think that would be very hard to go back to a life where someone else told me if I could go on vacation or not, and when I could go on vacation, and when I was gonna have to be away from my family for the holidays because they wanted me to work. And you kind of don't have that control as an RN in almost all employment situations. One last aspect about the schedule that I'll say that I did not like is that it's very common as an RN not only to be doing these 12-hour shifts, but to be rotating every other weekend. So most hospitals I worked at, if you were a full-time staff member, you had to work every other weekend. So you would work like a Friday, Saturday, Sunday one week, and then you would work like the next week you would work a scattered amount of days during the week and then have the weekend off, and then you would be back to the weekend again the next weekend. So it was always you covering weekend shifts. And some hospitals even made you take call in the ICU. So you would not only be covering weekend shifts every other weekend, so that means your every other weekend is gone for you of the year. Half your weekends are gone. And we did not get special pay for weekend work either. That was just considered standard set into your base pay that your requirement to work there was every other weekend you covered it. And you also had to be on call. So you had to be on call a certain number of weekends a year in case they needed backup staffing. And you got paid, I think, $1.50 an hour when we were on call. Now this was in Alabama, and we'll talk about pay in a minute for nurses, so trust me, we'll get into that. But yeah, we didn't really get compensated very well for that, and we had to be on call at home for the ICU. Oh, and I've never worked in a hospital that did this, but I almost did work at a hospital. Yale tried to, when I was gonna do a travel contract there, and I think Stanford, in the Bay Area, both of those facilities, when I almost took a contract there to work in their ICUs, they said it was mandatory for their ICU nurses to rotate between day shift and night shift. So they said that you would do a few weeks on day shift as a nurse, and then they would rotate you to night shift for a few weeks, and then they'd rotate you back to day shift. And that way they would kind of like cover both of their night shift and day shift, because like I mentioned earlier, it's always hard to get night shift coverage. So in their minds, that's the way they controlled that from being an issue. But that meant as a nurse working in that facility, you had to do night shift and day shift rotating, which totally messes up your circadian rhythm and your sleep patterns. Definitely not, I think, healthy for people. Let's get a little change of venue here. Scouter is sunbathing, relaxing over here. So let's talk about pay for a minute. I lived all over the country. I know pay varies greatly as a nurse. As a new grad in Alabama, I made I actually made $19.25 an hour. So I got $2 more than the $17.25 an hour base pay because I was an ICU nurse. So they gave you like critical care differential there. But yeah, pay for a day shift, new grad, bachelor's degree nurse was $19.25 an hour in the ICU there. So, and then night shift, it was like $22, it was like $3 more an hour to work night shift there. So that was in 2012, and that was my pay. So I thought I was making a lot of money. I thought that was really great until I started hearing about how much money other people were making across the nation and thought, I need to go travel nursing. I already kind of had it in my mind that I wanted to go travel nursing, but when I heard about how much people were truly making, I thought I need to really go travel nursing right away. That's when I realized how much the pay varied. Just for an example, the highest pay that I ever saw when I was a travel nurse is when I worked in the Bay Area. The staff nurses at that hospital in the Bay Area I was working at were making $62 an hour base pay as new grads. So you can tell that is a huge far cry difference from the $19.25 an hour I was making as a new grad a couple years prior in the ICU doing the same work. Actually, they did less work because they had a lot more resources, a lot more assistants and staff and mandatory breaks and all these things built in. So I'm just saying the pay varies greatly. It's going to be difficult for you to be able to tell exactly what the pay is based off just one internet search or Google search or something. But another thing that you have to consider is the cost of living with that pay. So while, yeah, $62 an hour versus $19 an hour sounds like a huge, crazy difference, the cost of living where I was at, I bought a home for $74,000, and that home near Stanford in the Bay Area would have been like $1.4 million. That same home, if you just transported it and put it there. And someone who lives near Stanford now currently can tell you, who's looking at homes, that home would be like $1.4 million here. So that's the reason there's a huge difference in pay. So just because you make a lot more money in one place versus the other as an RN doesn't necessarily mean that you actually get to keep that money or use it as disposable income. Another thing about pay as a nurse is it's almost always hourly. I don't really like hourly pay. I also don't really like salaried pay either, so let me explain. Hourly as a nurse can be very stifling because you're essentially only being paid when you're on the clock. And you have to clock in as soon as you get there or else you're not getting paid. You've got to clock out for your lunch break, and you're gonna have management on top of you about that kind of stuff. They're gonna be checking your time clocks and making sure you got your 30 and making sure you didn't take 28 minutes instead of 30 minutes. And you're gonna have people criticizing you when you clocked out at 7:07 p.m. instead of 7:00 p.m. or whatever, and that's overtime, and they don't want you getting any kind of version of overtime even if it's 7 minutes. And so there's lots of that kind of micromanaging. It just doesn't feel like professional work when you're punching a time clock and you're being managed that way, and you're being, every little minute is micro dissected out to figure out if you're getting any kind of money or not enough money. And I also found that stuff was used against you. They would use that data against you if you ever did something the manager didn't like or was pretty much trying to find reasons to come after you. They would say, oh yeah, you were 4 minutes late this day and you were 7 minutes late clocking out this day, and they can use that data to compile against you, to like build cases against you. So I just didn't like it. It felt like a very low form of autonomy when you punch a clock. And most everywhere you work as an RN, you're punching a clock. The other element about punching a clock and getting paid hourly like that is you never are going to be able to come in late or go home early. You're never allowed to do that kind of stuff. And I didn't realize what that kind of flexibility means for you professionally, for your day-to-day lifestyle and life, until later as a CRNA, when I had that ability because I wasn't punching clocks anymore, and realized how nice it is to know, like, hey, the work is done for the day and we don't really need you right now, and you can just go home, even though if it's in 30 minutes or an hour before your designated time to go home, and we're paying you technically to be here till this time, but there's nothing for you to do. So why would you just sit here and do nothing? Go home, when you'll be paid either way. So that kind of just professional respect and that level of autonomy, once you kind of taste that and get used to that, you realize how stifling that is as an RN to know, like, you have to sit there and stare at the time clock until the minute hits, because if you clock out too early, you're in trouble for that. You're considered like leaving work early or something. So the idea that like you're stuck there and you just cannot go home ever, even if you're done with work, although as a nurse you can't, I guess in this instance that if you've transferred your patients out and you had no patients coming in and they didn't need you, then you could leave technically. That was very, very rare to happen, but you could technically leave, but in that case, you were not getting paid. That meant you were just losing pay for that time. A nice thing about being an RN, an aspect of that time clock punching and that kind of lifestyle, is that anything above 40 hours in a week is considered overtime pretty much everywhere that I worked across the nation. And they hold true to that fact. So if you work beyond that 40 hours, you get at least time and a half. For your compensation for that kind of time additional. It's considered beyond normal amount of work hours for the week, and they're going to compensate you with time and a half, or even sometimes in California there's like double time and all kinds of, there's lots of rules in California. So I'll give some caveats here or there for California nurses, but I'll just tell you California nursing is like a different world from normal RN nursing in the other 49 states. So don't think, California nurses, don't hype up in here in the comments and be like, over here we get this and this. I know that California is different. There's lots of benefits and perks and things that boost up the California nursing experience, but I'm talking mostly to the 49 other states here that do work on this 40-hour a week, and they get time and a half after 40 hours in a week, and there's not a lot of other types of double pays and all these other perks and incentives. So yeah, as a nurse, you're gonna get that overtime pay. That is nice. Keep in mind though that you do get taxed. I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen this. When you work that overtime shift, you just realize they seem to somehow take more money from you in your taxes. So it never seems to actually net that much additional money you take home after they tax the heck out of it. But it is nice that they give you a little bit extra. As a CRNA, as physicians and providers and stuff, that's a rare to non-existent thing to get overtime. It's generally considered, at most groups I've worked at, it's generally considered like 45, 48 hours is pretty standard work for the week. And maybe some weeks you work a little less than that. Maybe some weeks you do like 48, 49 hours, it's a little more stretched. It's flexible. And that is not salaried exactly. Most CRNA positions are different. Like we're either salaried to a certain point, and then like if you go well beyond 46 hours or some kind of hour number, they'll start compensating you like an additional amount. But most of the time it's not time and a half or double time or anything like that. It's usually just like a set base rate that you agree upon. Like we'll give you this amount per hour if you go beyond what we consider as normal for you to work in this week. Another aspect about pay as a nurse is you're kind of locked in to a certain algorithmic pay increase schedule of, I don't know, 2 or 3% every year that they'll give you. And so when you come in as a nurse, as a W-2, and you start working at a hospital, it's going to be a very slow pay increase climb that you're going to get. There isn't really, I mean, sometimes you can do a certification or do an extra class and they might give you like a little bonus pay. Maybe if you have a really good union and they have like a clinical nurse ladder series set up, which I have seen here in the Bay Area at some hospitals, where if the nurse does certain tasks and jobs and gets certain educational milestones and stuff, they'll boost their pay to a different level. But in general, throughout the 49 other states that I worked within and have experience around, I didn't see a lot of that. I saw it was much more common to see every year you got a performance evaluation, and if you did okay, you got like 2%. If you did exceptional, you got a 3% raise. No one ever seemed to get exceptional. Everyone seemed to just get 2%. So if you make $19.25 an hour and you get a 2% raise every year after year, 20 years later, you're not making very much money still. So your pay increases very slow in minuscule amounts as an RN, and there's not really a good way to jump it up. You can change departments and you can go other places in that hospital as an RN, but you'll find that your pay usually stays the same. It's considered like a lateral move unless you move into like management, and oftentimes management positions as an RN actually make less money than you would have made as a clinical working nurse. So really the only true way to make more money as an RN is to leave that hospital and go to another hospital that's in desperate need and is willing to pay you a higher amount of money based off your experience level, or you can go back to school. The final thing that I'll say about pay that's kind of like the caveat to all this is you can go travel nursing. That's kind of like the ace up your sleeve kind of card that nurses can pull. And this was long before COVID contracts and a lot of like really insane pay rates were going around. Even way before that, travel nursing was something you could always do that would double your income pretty much instantaneously. Now granted, you have to move around and be flexible, and there's tax things you have to worry about as a travel nurse. There's other rules and regulations you have to care about. So some people don't like that experience. Some people don't want to do that experience. So to them, it's not worth it. Or they maybe have kids and circumstances that keep them from traveling around. But if you don't have those circumstances and you want to go travel nursing, you have always been able to pretty much double your income as a nurse if you want to go traveling, which I did for 2 years. And I highly recommend if you can do it. Mouth's getting dry talking so much.